Dr. Philip Howard is our guest this hour, and he is an associate professor at Michigan State University. If I had a Heroes Award, he would get one. His study of and book entitled Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, is the most succinct and compelling research I've read on the state of our food system in America. As you will learn from Professor Howard in our discussion, it's not just subsidies that create monopolies. Find out what has happened to buy out much of the organic movement, enabling dirty companies that use the big three: irradiation, GMOs, and toxic sewage sludge in their processes, and yet are allowed to call their products organic. In addition, as I've maintained for a long time and spoken of over the decades on our program, our seed bank is the foundation of our lives, and it is being controlled by fewer and fewer corporations, making the local farmer in every nation a feudal serf with no control even over their own privately held lands or what they will plant and the quality of the food they will grow. Thank you for joining us, Howard. Dr. Howard.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, wonderful, Phil. Your book is just extraordinary. I'm really blown away by it, I have to tell you, because I've been sort of in this field since, I guess, the 70s, but you've put it all in place. So why did you go this direction yourself as a researcher?
Well, it all started when I was a grad student at the University of Missouri. I was like most people. I got my food at the grocery store or the supermarket, didn't know much about where it came from. But I worked with my colleagues there, Dr. Bill Heffernan and Dr. Mary Hendrickson, and they'd been studying this for decades. And, I was really surprised to learn just how few firms controlled so much of our food supply. We have a food system that's shaped like an hourglass where we have 2 million farmers in the U.S. at the top, 300 million people who eat, but a much, much smaller number of firms that control how that food gets from farmers to us.
You made an interesting observation in the beginning of your book, and I assume the college students that you teach read this for their studies, and if they don't, they should. You point out there's a difference between a political economy, which is different from just economics.
Yeah, economics and political science, they often see their fields as very distinct, and they don't recognize all the interconnections between the two. Big firms have a very big influence on the policies that shape, the governments enact. They have much more influence than average citizens. And, it flows the other way, too. And a great example is the revolving door between government and industry. Mm-hmm. Many people, like Michael Taylor, will go back and forth between a firm like Monsanto and a regulatory agency like the FDA and back again.
You also make a very clear case for the fact that these large firms, whether we're talking about packaged foods and beverages, retail and commodities, and input agriculture, and these you outline are the basic parts of food ownership and control. But these firms aren't simply using market trends. As you make clear, they are making market trends.
Yeah, they're reshaping our society in many different ways, ways that are hidden from us. One example is our consumption habits. They can influence universities and public schools and advertising, product placement in movies and so on, to convince us that we need to spend more money on the more expensive foods that they provide rather than being more self-reliant.
Yeah, and that's we'll talk about that because there's a wonderful woman in Europe that talks about this a great deal, that we really need to come back down to small-scale regionalism worldwide, and there's really the right case for it. But you pointed out that, we're going to talk about some of the very particulars from regional to global domination, but you said there were a number of things that struck me as really significant. One is that these major corporations, whether it's a McDonald's or whether it's Cargill or as you point out, Monsanto, they have been able to change the interpretation of antitrust laws. And we're talking about monopolies that get significant subsidies from the government.
Yeah, this is something, these antitrust laws were enacted at the turn of the century in the U.S. Up through the 1930s with the progressive movement. And at that time, they played a role in really hindering industries from becoming more concentrated, like A&P, which was the Walmart of its day, the first supermarket, they really slowed their growth. But by the late 1970s, firms had been frustrated with these antitrust laws, and they were able to influence both the executive branch and the judicial branch to really reinterpret those laws. So they're viewed very differently today, and it's very rare that a proposal to merge or acquire another firm is not approved. And you have the bigger and bigger combinations of firms every year.
Well, I remember in your book you talked about just poultry breeding, that there's only 2 or 3 firms, I had no idea it was this bad, controls 94% of all sales.
Yeah, that's worldwide, too, not just the U.S. So there are 2 European firms that control poultry, and it's even worse for turkey. Just 2 firms control well over 99% of the genetics for turkey worldwide.
You know, when Smithfield Shanghai bought the company, and we're beginning to see more and more of the China influence of buying up these major corporations in our country, and with them come enormous swaths of land. People seem to be forgetting that, you know, there's this purchasing going on of our lands by foreign entities, and it doesn't seem to ever make it into the press. So talk to us a bit from your own perspective, Phil, about the media's lack of, what's the right word, attention on what's really happening to our food supply.
Yeah, these are things that you really have to read the business press or even trade journals to really get a glimpse of what's going on. But there have been a few, the size of the deals in just the last year have brought more attention to the issue. So the fact that Monsanto, a U.S. headquartered seed chemical company, could be acquired by Bayer, a German firm, and then with Dow and DuPont merging, we could end up with going from 3 firms headquartered in the U.S. to just 1 in the seed and chemical industry. So there are now members of Congress who are concerned about this and holding hearings. But that's kind of a change from even just a few years ago when the media wasn't really drawing any attention to these issues.
And that's only sort of at the highest end of the issue. You know, the reality of, I was reading this fascinating study in Acres USA, which is actually how I learned of your book from an interview they did with you. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm always promoting Acres USA to you, and I will again, www.acresusa.com, or call and subscribe. It is the most phenomenal magazine, I think, anywhere in the world in terms of sustainable, organic, biodynamic farming for the small and large scale person. 1-800-355-5313. That's 1-800-355-5313. So coming back, though, to these companies and the mergers of whether it's Dow and DuPont or Monsanto and Bayer, I mean, when you look at Monsanto and Bayer, they were both in really nefarious, Nazi-related industries, and all of our agriculture after World War I and significantly after World War II was really based on the same premises and the same philosophy as chemical warfare, which is an acceptable risk strategy. Share with us what's happening, though, because, the New York Times recently had this little front page blitz on GMOs, didn't live up to promise of, more food and less pesticide. And I was like thinking when I read the article, you weaklings, you weaked out. Like, why didn't you tell the real story of the dangers of this product?
Yeah, what's happened is the seed industry was taken over by the chemical industry in the 70s. They were struggling to increase their sales because of Rachel Carson and others. There were more regulations on their products. They were having trouble increasing sales globally. So in their attempts to try and beat the average return of other firms, they really had no option but to combine with each other. So we went from 30 firms at that time to just 6 chemical firms. And then shortly after that, they started taking over a related industry, the seed industry. The seed industry used to be incredibly competitive. I mean, going back 30, 40 years ago, there wasn't a single firm that had a 1% market share. And now we have just a handful of firms that control well over half the global proprietary seed market.
And describe for our audience what that means. Most of us aren't educated about not only where our food comes from, but where the seed came from that the farmer used. And I'm not even talking about GMOs for a moment. So let's exclude GMOs for a moment and talk to us about how the seed gets distributed in the world and who gets what and who's controlling it. Because, as I see and as you see and as many of us who are very much concerned about the loss of seed banking and even laws against it now, we're talking about potential political famines on the scale no one would want to ever wish on anybody.
Yeah, and part of the reason is the government has continually enacted more and more intellectual property protection for seeds. So the industries have asked for this, and every year there are more and more restrictions on saving seeds. So it's to the point where you can take a conventional hybrid tomato seed, which you probably wouldn't want to save anyway because it's not going to have the same characteristics, but the intellectual property protections are now so strong that you're not allowed to save and replant that seed. And it started with commodities like corn and soybeans, but very quickly, by the late 90s, early 2000s, these big chemical seed companies started buying up fruit and vegetable seed companies. So even home gardeners may be buying seeds from Monsanto or Syngenta without even realizing it, because there are a number of varieties that are controlled by those firms, like big beef tomatoes or early girl tomatoes. Those are owned by Monsanto, and all the restrictions that they place on those seeds, they become more and more restrictive every year.
It used to be before World War II, most farmers had seed collection rooms in their farms. And people collected their own seed to plant the following year because, A, it saved resources and they knew the quality of the food they were planting. But now let's introduce the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms, which are contaminating the seed bank, whether it's deliberate or drift-related warfare, as I like to call it. We have a really serious problem now that isn't really owned up to in this country. It is in Europe, where they are doing their best to outlaw GMO seed planting, etc. Talk to us about the difference between the European perspective on farming at this point and the industrial agri-farm of America.
Well, it's not quite as different as it might appear, although there are many countries in Europe that have prohibited planting genetically engineered seeds. There have been a few test plots and so forth. It's largely been kept out of the supply of the foods people eat. It's been labeled, for example, in nearly every country of the world except the U.S. And so it's usually only fed to animals in Europe.
Even though we know that cows who eat it abort their young. I mean, the research is so clear how bad it is.
Yeah, so the other difference between the EU and the U.S. is restrictions on saving seed are actually more restrictive in the EU. They kind of follow the U.S. model and then even went beyond it. One small difference is they were later in patenting non-genetically engineered seeds. There have been a few examples of tomatoes and broccoli that they've patented, products of conventional breeding, but the patent office there is now under pressure to undo that because the civil society actors, activists in the EU are much more visible and much more effective in lobbying the government and challenging these patents on life.
Mm-hmm. Well, to anybody with just some basic common sense, I mean, to all of us, I think, in the listening audience, unless somehow or other you're making a career and making your livelihood by doing this work, it's like, how is it that a company can take out some sort of patent on something they don't create? I mean, I read in one of your comments, I think it was Cargill's CEO on page 152 really tells us the attitude. Cargill is, quote, engaged in the commercialization of photosynthesis. I mean, I really don't understand. It was bad enough when the Supreme Court decided that corporations are citizens, but I don't understand, Phil, how, truthfully, how you can patent or how you can claim intellectual propriety over something you haven't created.
Yeah, it really in no way meets the traditional criteria for a patent, but they've been able to use their tremendous political power to change the system to allow it and to really benefit from it by increasing prices for what farmers pay and ultimately what we pay at the grocery store.
You know, it's such, for those who haven't studied this topic, this is an extraordinary book, Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, by Philip H. Howard. It's a Bloomsbury release, 2016. And the thing that's so amazing are all the charts in it. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of that, because when you look at the labeling law efforts in this country, whether it was in Oregon or Vermont, et cetera, and then how these major corporations, many of who had already bought out the organic companies, made it impossible to get the labeling law through. And we'll talk about what that means. Our guest again, Phil Howard, his book, Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, Bloomsbury Academic, 2016 release.
Hello, this is Don Weaver, co-author with John Hamaker of The Survival of Civilization, free at soilandhealth.org, and Regenerate the Earth, available from vibranthealthandwealth.com. Thanks for helping and for listening to Zohara Hieronimus at 21st Century Radio.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Our guest is Dr. Philip Howard. His most recent book, Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, a Bloomsbury Academic 2016 release. Dr. Howard is an associate professor at the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. And so while we're in that neck of the woods, Phil, I wanted to talk about something you mentioned, which is referred to as reclaiming the commons, which is a topic I just adore, and I'm glad you talked about it. And you said that the University of Wisconsin professors, some of them are working on this relative to open source seeds. So I'd like to focus our attention again back to this issue of GMOs and seeds and what's happening to make it difficult for even those groups of people worldwide who have been working at saving our heirloom seeds or saving indigenous seeds as really insurance for the future.
Yeah, there are some professors at Wisconsin, and they're working with professors all over the rest of the country now that are developing a pledge that you can put on a package of seeds that it's open source. So they've developed, for example, an organic variety of carrot that falls under this open source seed initiative, which means that people are free to save and replant it. They're trying to use the intellectual property laws of this country kind of against themselves to give people the freedom, the ability to save and replant these seeds.
What I don't understand is how it's gotten so crazy.
Yeah, it's been kind of a gradual process in which Congress has passed laws, and then the Supreme Court has ruled on some cases that have just made it harder and harder for farmers to save and replant their own seed. The precedents just keep getting extended. It started with genetically engineered seeds because they were supposed to be novel creations, even though those changes were just a tiny, tiny part of their genome. Now they're being extended to conventional seeds, and even beyond that, Monsanto is trying to get a patent on any variety of broccoli with extended heads that make it easier to harvest, even if it's from a totally different variety from what they're claiming in their patent applications. So it's just a matter of the power of these dominant firms to just put pressure on governments and for lower level bureaucrats to just wear them down with their continued request to extend.
And yet it's so extraordinary to me. It reminds me in the medical community how they'll yell and scream about herbs and homeopathy, and nobody's ever going to die from a homeopathic remedy, I can promise you that. And yet we have all kinds of deaths every year from over-the-counter drugs and then the prescription drugs, and something like, I think it was like 83% of most drugs prescribed are for things they've never been tested for. Well, the same thing can be said about hybridization and genetic modification. These entities are not proven safe before they're put into the public market. So it's never about safety.
No, and clear example of that is the efforts that some states have tried to ban seed libraries. So these are public libraries establish a lending library for seeds, so people check out a pack at the beginning of the growing season, return the seeds that they saved at the end of the season. Some states, like Pennsylvania, are using commercial seed laws to crack down on these libraries, prevent them under the guise of safety. They're claiming that there could be weeds mixed in with the seeds and so on. It's clearly a dramatic overreaction to something that
and as you point exactly, but you point out this is the routine. I mean, this is the gambit. You find something that is autonomous from the government, that free people presumably are doing of their own accord for the benefit of themselves and society. And then what they do is they come down with regulations and requirements that only the enormous corporations could afford. And you used milk as a really good example when this ultra-pasteurization came into force and how it forced so many of the milk dairy farmers out of business in this country.
Yeah, and it's still happening today. The states where farmers have herd shares or other ways to kind of get around the ban on pasteurized milk for people who are really demanding raw milk, the state has been, pulling people over with rifles and SWAT teams and, shutting down natural food stores in Los Angeles and so on. I mean, it's, here in Michigan we have an example of basically all heirloom varieties of pigs were outlawed based on physical characteristics. Unless it's the type of pig that has been bred to be in a confined animal feeding operation, a factory farm, it's simply not allowed in the state.
It's so peculiar. I mean, because from state to state, there'll be a different ideology depending on the political persuasion of, that state legislature or that particular USDA or that particular extension service. You point out that so many of the organic companies that started small have been bought out by these major standard companies. And I mentioned it in the introduction because I think it's just so important, is that when activists and farmers want the Farm Bill, for instance, to really be clear, I thought it was extraordinary. One of these things you mentioned that, for instance, when the 1990 Farm Bill came out, and there's lots of stuff in it that has nothing to do with agriculture, but they pack it in as favors to the states, it wasn't released until 1997. And one of them, the things that I remember this because I covered it at the time, was we were all really concerned about what an organic definition meant. And you point out that when all was said and done, like Coca-Cola, who owns Odwella, and you think, oh, I'm drinking such healthy things, and there's probably nothing really healthy or wholesome in it. It's a lot of whatever. But that it redefined it. You pointed out that it meant that these major corporations who irradiate food, which was a campaign I spent 10 years against, GMOs, which we continue to resist for those of us who, think it's important to, and the last is the sewage sludge. So talk to us about these three methodologies in food processing and how it slid by as being called organic.
Well, that was the proposal when the first draft of the standards was released, that it would allow on organic farms genetically engineered organisms, irradiation and sewage sludge. But that was kind of a tactic to put out a very ridiculous proposal that was eventually defeated by a record number of public comments.
Yeah, I was one of them. I think there were millions of us, actually, that responded.
Yeah. But in the process, the actual organic standards were probably not as stringent as many people hoped. So those big three were prohibited, but the USDA organic standard is basically a minimum standard which says you're not allowed to use this list of synthetic herbicides, pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers, and so on. And for processing, it's even less restrictive. I mean, there are all kinds of non-organic ingredients that are allowed in processed foods that are allowed to have that USDA organic label on them.
So you record all of these in your book, all of these acquisitions, and an example is Seeds of Change. I just pick it out because I used to interview them when they first founded their wonderful organization. And it was all organic seeds, and then it was bought by M&M Mars in 1997.
Yeah, that was really puzzling to people at first, because why was a company that makes junk food, chocolate, buying an organic seed company? But it turns out one of the heirs to the Mars fortune started working for Seeds of Change, and he kind of facilitated that sale. And then they immediately started getting into frozen organic foods and things that were closer to the M&M Mars business model. But there have been a number of other changes over the years which are really hard to find out because it's a privately held company. But they've shut down their research farm in Arizona and a number of other things that people are upset about in terms of not representing those sustainability ideals that the company started with.
You pointed out there's almost 19,000 organic farmers in the United States, and a lot of them are either working in regional distribution or local distribution or in CSAs, community-sponsored agriculture. But now you see things like a Wegmans is a good example, or even Safeway, that they have their own organic lines. So let's talk about that. How what was once sort of the, people like me who have been eating organic for 30 some years, looking for it, and now pretty much a consumer educated populace saying this is what we want. And it's really sort of a bottom up pressure rather than a top down.
Yeah, it's really, you could almost say there's two ends of organic, because you have small organic farmers who sell it through CSAs or farmers markets, but then you have large-scale monoculture organic farms like Earthbound Farms contracts with very large growers in California who are farming hundreds and hundreds of acres of all just the same crop. We have less than 1% of certified organic farmland in the U.S., but sales are approaching 5%.
That's good.
A lot of that food is actually coming from China and Latin America and other parts of the world. So not all of these changes are occurring just in the U.S. So we have, an example of China. USDA inspectors don't get over there very often, so there's some concern that the standards are not enforced the same way that they are in the U.S.
Well, we know the answer to that. I love these things that get passed off as discussion. It's like, oh, really? Oh, what does everybody think these international trade treaties are about? Another area that you talk about, I just want to focus for a moment, is, for instance, 7-Eleven is Japanese owned. How do you think, from your research, does foreign ownership impact local, if not regional, food distribution?
Well, it's increasingly hard to find industries that don't have foreign ownership. We talked about how Smithfield was acquired by a Chinese firm. A big beef processor in the U.S. was acquired by a Brazilian firm. We now have German and Chinese firms taking over major seed suppliers. So the Japanese firm, which is very dominant in the convenience store industry, and the number 2 firm is owned by a Canadian firm. The list goes on, but I think one of the issues is that the elite are increasingly global. They don't even recognize national boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
They're very willing to lobby national governments to change policies in ways that benefit them. But I think people who are running 7-Eleven in Japan and who are running a big food firm in the U.S. have more in common than we have in common with the CEO of a big food firm in the U.S. So I'm not sure that national boundaries are as important to them as they are to us.
I think that's a really important observation, and the laws, the global laws, well, there really aren't ones to govern these kinds of things, and it does go nation by nation or region by region. And you point out, though, that all of this consolidation, whether we're talking about the input area of farming, or whether we're talking about retailing or distributing, which is where the power is that a lot of these companies have forced out the labor unions. And so the pressure points, there aren't as many for the average person. One of the things you point out is worker strikes, and do they affect these enormous corporations like Safeway or Kroger's? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, Walmart really dramatically changed the supermarket industry, because supermarket industry used to be a middle-class job. You could work for Kroger or a Safeway for decades and get to have a pretty good income. But Walmart's model was to pay their employees nothing. And so in order to feel like they had to compete and provide the same returns to their shareholders, Safeway wanted to slash the wages and benefits for their workers. So the union went on strike, and what happened was the two other major supermarket firms in California, their workers were members of the same union, they locked out their employees. So all of these supermarkets hired replacement employees. They knew they would lose business because the public was supportive of the workers, but they actually pooled their profits during this time. And the Attorney General of California filed an antitrust suit against these three supermarket chains. At the time, their CEOs were all making well over $10 million a year in compensation, but wanting to cut the wages for their workers. But they succeeded. They were not even prosecuted. The court threw out the antitrust suit that the Attorney General brought, and they succeeded in breaking the union, and the union caved to those demands. So now the supermarket industry is very low wage and few benefits.
Well, and as you point out, retailers weren't always a pack, so to speak, like you just described. They were representing only their companies, and this has really changed. And then the other thing that you point out is that when these companies are so large and they control the distribution, they can put such pressure on both ends, either the input or the delivery end, so that there's very little flexibility even when they're franchised. People think that franchises, oh, isn't this great? Somebody has their own store. Does somebody who gets involved in one of these franchises, whether it's a food convenience store or something else, is it a good business or is it really sort of like a slave labor business?
Yeah, increasingly, fast food restaurants, convenience stores, they're putting more and more restrictions on their franchisees, taking away what little freedoms they had before, and they're putting all the risk on those franchisees. So it's often very exploitative. Like many recent immigrants from Southeast Asia, get into these franchises and end up being very much exploited. And the courts are not very sympathetic. They often rule in favor of these big firms. So it's been a situation where they've, the shareholders, Wall Street analysts have cheered the fact that they've put more and more pressure on their franchisees and taken advantage of them.
Well, and it's so clear that would happen, because if you reduce ownership and you increase control, then obviously you don't have the kind of latitude that you think going in. But as you point out, if you don't know, and it seems like a possible opportunity, it's just pretty tragic how all these things go sort of under the radar of the general public discussion. We'll be right back. Our guest is Dr. Philip Howard. His book, Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, Bloomsbury Academic, 2016 release. And if you couldn't get all that down, don't forget all of our guests and links to their books and their work are at www.21st21stcenturyradio.com. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Dr. Philip Howard is with us. His book, Concentration and Power in the Food System, Who Controls What We Eat, a Bloomsbury Academic 2016 release. So, Phil, coming back to this question of the loss of freedom and this very peculiar development to me, because it's something that really interests me, so I'm paying a little more attention to it than I have in the past, about the seed saving challenge and the notion of a commons. And I just, it's just, you've studied this, and I just don't really understand how it could possibly ever be illegal for somebody to plant their own food and then save their own seed, and yet it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a history of, going back to England hundreds of years ago, where people had lands in common. It provided a lot of their subsistence. And then roughly the time that factories were being developed, the common lands were privatized. People lost their livelihoods. And then were kind of forced to go to cities where they were low-cost laborers for these new factories. What's interesting is that the elites at the time had this ideology that the government should not interfere with markets, but that's exactly what they did in privatizing these commons, and they rationalized that. And similar things are happening today. They rationalize these intellectual property laws, which are strongly interfering with free markets and competition because they benefit the most powerful. And it's the smaller seed companies, the farmers, and people who eat who are all losing out from these trends.
Well, and of course it has international implications. Particularly, I remember when India was fighting the introduction of aspartame instead of their normal sugar, their cane sugar, and then they were fighting the GMO seed because of the destruction it's making to their many, many, ancient strains of foods that are being displaced. And so when you look at the food industry as an example of how fewer and fewer companies control what's made, what's in it, the quality of it, how it's distributed, and the cost, the people that suffer the most are the growers and the consumers.
Meaning, particularly low-income consumers or ethnic minorities. I mean, they are often in markets that are least well-served. They have the lowest purchasing power, and they often bear the brunt of these trends. They are disproportionately marketed junk foods and alcohol and all kinds of products that have negative health impacts.
Which, I mean, from a sociological perspective, one would have to say, boy, that looks a little scarily like it's deliberate. One starts to go, this is an interesting kind of eugenics, maybe. I mean, there's some really extraordinary things that can be said sometimes. And I say that, people go, oh, Zoe, that's rather conspiratorial of you. And it's not to be. It's to look at how patterns get instituted and then they're institutionalized. And once they're institutionalized, we now have, what we call these sort of deserts, food deserts. But famine is a reality. And as you point out, I don't think there's ever been famine really from lack of food. It's the political will that creates famine. That's my own belief and observation.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, you could look at any country that has experienced a great famine. They're going to be exporting food to more industrialized countries. But the rhetoric of feeding the world serves a useful purpose for these firms because it can obscure what they're really doing. It can make them look like they're doing something good when all they're really doing is increasing returns for their shareholders.
And restricting the local economies in each country of the world from actually developing in their old subsistence farming style, which is actually very resilient and sustainable, and it didn't require chemical inputs. And now that the cancer rate is so high in India from the farm community, there are a lot of farmers who are saying we're not going to use the poison anymore. And there are parts in the world, in Cuba, for instance, in places in China and in Russia, where they're saying, we've toxed out our land so much we can't grow anything anymore, and the people are so sick. So it's not like everybody in the world is asleep to what's happened over the last 60 to 100 years. But the effort to change requires so much vigilance, I guess, on the part of the consumer. So let's talk about that, because you've studied how these movements start, how the control is lost at the local level. What are things individuals can do that really matters?
Well, I think creating alternatives to the current system, what I call bypassing that hourglass-shaped food system, making direct connections to producers or becoming your own producer as much as possible. A simple thing to do is to grow some sprouts. Even if you have very little space, you can grow some sprouts and have a very nutritious product that doesn't involve a large-scale monoculture. And if you can go a little further and plant a garden or join a community garden, but also really be vigilant, as you said, and kind of look behind the labels. There are some tools that are making that easier. One is called Good Guide, G-O-O-D guide.com, and another one is called Buycott, B-U-Y-C-O-T-T. They can help you see who actually owns the product, in some cases scores for environment, health, social impacts, and so you can really steer your purchases towards companies that are smaller and more independent rather than supporting these big companies. And sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference between the two.
Well, and as you point out in your masterful book, when you look at these charts, it's like, the power plays of how many small companies can a large company buy in a year? Well, evidently a lot. And when you looked at soybean and corn account for 50% of everything that's grown in this nation, that's pretty insane. Why?
Oh, part of it is subsidies. So the people who are growing those crops may actually lose money, but they get subsidies or what's now called crop insurance from the federal government to make up for low market prices, and they can, still keep the farm. But who really benefits are the commodity processors, the people that are processing corn, soybeans, or feeding them to livestock. So the meat processors, those are the real beneficiaries.
It's, when I looked at your book, I don't remember what page it was, but I had never really understood this to the degree you made it so clear. Quote, the water issue in California, the produce, you said, accounts for only 2% of the economy, but uses 80% of the water.
Yeah. And this is in the middle of a drought. So it's very large-scale monoculture farmers who draw the majority of that water. So it's taxpayer dollars that are subsidizing that water.
We've done a number of shows on the problem of the monoculture and what it's done to the topsoil and exactly the kinds of things you're saying. We did a beautiful discussion of a farm that, uses the biome in layers. And so there's nut farming and there's grapevines, and it's just such a beautiful model. And for some reason, the gentleman's name escapes me, and I know he's world-renowned, but I seem to be doing that more and more. I used to remember all my guest names, and now I'm forgetting most of them. I remember the interviews, but not always the name. So if I don't remember your name, don't take it personally. Is there another Philip Howard that is a researcher in politics? I could swear I interviewed somebody with that name.
There are Phil Howards everywhere. There's one that lives just down the street from me. Every town I've lived in.
That's very funny. I once looked up Paradise, USA, and I thought that would be a great book to go to visit every town that's named Paradise, find out why. All right, so we have just a few minutes left, and you've been doing this for quite a while. What are the things that concern you the most? I mean, I read this stuff, and I get pretty freaked out, to be quite frank, because I'm really concerned about global famine as a result of political control. And I think that there are major discussions of that sort worldwide. And I, for one, would like to be a person who works against that.
Yeah, one thing I touch on in the book, but I think needs more attention is the lack of diversity of our food supplies, becoming increasingly uniform. So I'm on a panel of people who are drawing attention to this issue. We're called IPES Food. And there's a new report called From Uniformity to Diversity, and it compares different food systems and how we need to transition to a much more diverse system that encourages a lot more diversity, because we're very vulnerable to something like a blight or an avian influenza that could just wipe out a major source of food for the entire world.
Totally. I mean, when I was interviewing Lester Brown one year and we were talking about the world food supply, and he said of actual food, there's only 70-some days of food worldwide. And, when you think about the famine in ancient Egypt and they put away enough food for 7 years, there's a disconnect in the world between the sense of auto-dependency that it just shows up at your grocery store and appreciating that there's more and more lack of freedom to be sure that you could, as a community, grow your own food and have your own food should something actually happen worldwide, or should there be, something nuclear, or should there be an earth change, or should there be climate change that, I just feel like it's all very short-sighted. And that's why I do programs like this. Not that it's affecting millions of people, but when you talk to your students, how do they respond?
Most of them are very surprised and a little depressed. But, I like to reassure them that, looking at these trends, if you look below the surface, you see how much effort it takes these firms to increase their power. I mean, they really put an enormous amount of effort into changing the way we buy our foods and government policies. And some of them are really struggling to continue to increase their power. And their, my favorite example is the beer industry. So when a student's really depressed, I say, go to the grocery store and look at the beer section now compared to just 5 years ago. The space for the big, macro brewers is starting to decline, and these smaller craft brewers are taking more and more shelf space.
Mm-hmm. But it's so interesting because it's an addictive substance. It's legal. It just fascinates me where we see in our world some sort of autonomous development and where we lose it. And when you look at the reality of the minority farmer and the minority consumer and the minority landscape taking the brunt of all of the agricultural failure, I mean, it's a tragic story, and it's a true one. I want to thank you, Dr. Howard, for such a beautiful job. Anything else you want to share with us before we say good evening?
No, I just mentioned that it's not just beer. That's the most dramatic example, but there are a lot of examples like just local production of bread with local wheat varieties, and ancient grain varieties. So there are a lot of positive examples that we didn't get a chance to talk too much about today.
No, I agree with you, and we'll do that on another occasion because the young artisan communities, the boomers' children have come of age, and it's really extraordinary to watch and celebrate. Thank you again for being our guest. Again, you can follow up with Dr. Howard on our website at 21stcenturyradio.com and Acres USA, www.acresusa.com. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.